The morning they came off the trailer, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2003, and the sky was the color of old pewter, low and close, the kind of sky that sits on the ridge and does not move all day. The temperature had not climbed above 38 degrees by 10 in the morning, and the creek bottom below the south pasture was breathing fog in long, slow threads that drifted up through the cottonwoods and then just dissolved, as if the ground were exhaling something it had held since August. I remember that detail because I was standing at the fence gate watching the county road, and I remember thinking that the fog was coming up out of the dry creek bed, which struck me as strange, because that creek had not had water running in it since the first week of June. It had been a hard, dry summer. Not catastrophic, not the kind of summer that breaks a family permanently, but the grinding, unrelenting kind that takes 10 pounds off every animal you own and makes you do arithmetic in your head every night before you sleep. And into that kind of morning, into that kind of year, my daughter Clara pulled up the county road in a borrowed gooseneck trailer being pulled by a truck that was not entirely her own, and inside that trailer were 65 of the most pitiful beef heifers I had seen in many years of looking at cattle. She had paid $20 a head for them, $1,300 total, which she had saved from working the afternoon shift at the grain elevator in town the previous spring, and which represented, as best I could tell, just about every liquid dollar she had at the time. She was 26 years old. She had been farming her 87 acres for 2 seasons, and by noon that day the word was already moving through the county the way words do, and by the time the diner on the main street closed its lunch service, the story had grown, and the version that had grown had somehow added a detail about 40 head of wormy calves and a purchase price of $10, which was worse than the actual story in every direction. And I will say that I did not correct it, because in my experience, correcting a diner story only gives it another 2 weeks of life. My neighbor to the east, a man named Harlan, who had been running a clean Angus operation on 320 acres since before Clara was born, pulled his truck up to the fence line on the Wednesday morning after the heifers arrived. He left the engine running, which is something a man does when he does not intend to stay long. He looked at the heifers in the south pasture, and he looked at them for a good 30 seconds without speaking, which, for Harlan, constituted a significant investment of attention. Then he looked at me. He said, in the plain-spoken way he had of being polite while delivering a verdict, "What exactly is that girl doing with 65 starving heifers on 87 acres in October?" He did not say it as a question. He said it as a statement that had a question mark somewhere behind it that he was too courteous to deploy directly. I told him she was farming. He nodded once, looked back at the heifers, and then looked at me again, and said that he supposed she was, and that he hoped she knew what she was doing, and then he put his truck in gear and drove back down the fence line, and I watched his taillights disappear around the stand of Osage orange at the corner of his property. I will say this about Harlan. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain man. There is a difference, and it matters, and I have tried my whole life to be the one and not the other, with mixed results. But the certainty in his voice that morning sat with me. Because the truth was, I was not entirely sure she knew what she was doing either. And I want to be honest about that. What I did know, or what I suspected, in the way you suspect something you cannot yet prove, was that Clara had not bought those heifers for sentiment, and she had not bought them for foolishness. She had bought them because of something her grandfather had written in a notebook, which she had found in the cedar chest in the back room of this house the previous winter, and which she had read 4 times through before she showed it to me, and which, when she showed it to me, I held for about 10 minutes before I put it back in the chest, because I was not ready for what it was saying. I will own that. My own father's handwriting, careful and square, in a marbled composition book with a brown cover that had gone soft at the corners from 14 years of sitting in that chest, and I put it back, and I went and checked on the hay bales, because that is what a man does when something is too large to look at directly. Clara did not put it back. Clara read the notebook twice more and then drove to 3 different counties looking at animals. That is the difference between 26 and 63, and it is not a difference that favors 63. My father had bought this ground in 1959, 112 acres then, which grew over the following 20 years to 208, and which I have held at that number my entire farming life, adding nothing and losing nothing, which is either a statement of stability or a statement of timidity, depending on who is making the assessment. He was a methodical man. He kept records the way some men keep religion, with consistency and a certain reverence for the act of writing things down, as if the writing itself were a form of faithfulness. He logged rainfall by the 10th of an inch. He logged soil temperatures at 4-inch depth through the growing season. He logged the day the first killdeer arrived every spring, because he believed, and I think he was right, that the killdeer arrived exactly when the ground was ready to work, not a week before and never 2 weeks before. And if you watched for them, you never got your equipment in the field too early and ruined your structure for the year. He logged which sections of which fields drained fast after a rain and which sat. He logged the yields in bushels per acre going back to 1960, every crop year, every field, in a column of penciled numbers that remain, to this day, the most useful single document I own. And at the back of the last notebook I found in that cedar chest, the one dated 1988 and 1989, there was a section he had written about the dry creek that runs along the south edge of Clara's 87 acres, which is the ground I sold her at below market value when she started, ground that had been part of the original home farm, ground that I knew and did not know in the way you know a thing you have stopped looking at carefully. The section was 3 pages long. The first 2 pages were observation notes, tight and practical, about the drainage pattern of the South Creek bottom in dry years versus wet years, about the soil color change he had noticed at a certain bend in the creek, about the way cattle had been congregating at one specific location along the dry creek bed in late summer for as long as he had owned the ground. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, in letters slightly larger than his usual hand, underlined twice with a pencil line gone faint with time, he had written 4 words and a question mark. He had written, "Water below here still?" And that was all. No answer, no follow-up entry, no note in any subsequent book about whether he had investigated or what he had found. Just the question, underlined, and then nothing, as if he had written it down as a reminder to himself, and then the season had moved on, the way seasons do, and the question had gone into the chest with the notebook and waited there for 14 years for someone to be ready to pick it up. Clara was ready. I was not. But I want to tell you about what happened when she started paying attention, because it is a story about what the ground knows when you get quiet enough to listen to it, and I have come to believe, after 60-some years of working this county, that the ground does know things, and that the cattle know things the ground knows, and that a person who watches both carefully enough will eventually be told what they need to hear, if they can learn to be patient about the form the telling takes. That patience is not easy. It is, in my observation, the one thing that cannot be taught in a classroom or demonstrated on a graph. It is arrived at through accumulation and defeat, mostly defeat, and Clara had enough of both already in her 2 seasons of farming to have started learning it, which was why, I think, she was the one who read that notebook instead of setting it aside. And it is worth saying that she had another quality that I recognized from her grandfather and have tried with limited success to reproduce in myself, which is the quality of looking at something cheap and pitied, and asking not what is wrong with it, but what it knows that I do not. 65 starving heifers at $20 a head know something. The question is whether you are the kind of person who is willing to stay long enough to find out what it is. The heifers were in poor condition. I do not want to minimize that. They were thin across the loin, rough-coated for the season, and several of them were carrying the particular look around the eye that tells you an animal has been under stress for long enough that it has become its default state, rather than a temporary condition. They had come from an estate dispersal sale 3 counties to the southwest, a drought year liquidation, ground that had given up its grass in July and not recovered, and the old man who had run those cattle had passed in September without warning, and his family, who were not farming people, had made the decision to sell everything and settle the estate before winter, which meant that the cattle went at what the market would bear on short notice in a bad grass year, which was $20 a head for open heifers that nobody had the feed to carry and nobody wanted to look at. Clara had looked at them for 45 minutes before she signed the bill of sale. She looked at their structure, at their bone, at their mouths, and at their dispositions. She walked through the pen twice. The second time through, she walked slowly, and she told me later that what she was looking for was whether they would move away from her all at once as a group, or whether some of them would stand and watch her come. The ones that stand and watch, she said, are the ones that are curious rather than just frightened, and curiosity in a bovine is a quality that feeds and care will build on, while pure fright is harder to come back from. 11 of the 65 stood and watched her. She bought all 65 because the price was the same regardless, and because she knew she could not select the curious ones out without paying a higher price for them than the estate would honor on short notice. $1,300 for 65 head. She had done the arithmetic before she left home. She put them on the south pasture, which carried about 40 acres of grass that was short and dry from the summer, but was still grazable, and she began feeding a small supplement ration twice a day and giving them time. She was watching them, though. That is the part I want to be clear about, because the watching is not passive. The watching is a kind of work, and it requires the same consistency and discipline as any other farm task, and most people are not willing to do it because it does not look like work, and nobody gives you credit for it. Clara was out before first light most mornings, standing at the south fence, watching where the cattle moved, watching what they grazed first and what they left, watching where they stood in the afternoon heat, watching where they gathered at dusk. She kept a small spiral notebook in her coat pocket, the kind you can buy at the hardware store for $1.50, and she wrote in it every day, date and temperature, and what she had observed, in a handwriting that looked, when I saw the pages, startlingly like her grandfather's. She had never seen his notebooks when she was developing her own habit of record-keeping. That is the kind of thing that does not have a clean explanation, and I have decided to stop looking for one. What she noticed inside the first 2 weeks of November was that the cattle were making a pattern, not all of them, not as a herd, but a consistent subset, usually 7 to 12 animals at a time, drifting south in the late afternoon, moving down the slope toward the dry creek bed, and congregating at a specific location along the south bank. A bend in the creek where the bank cut in under an overhang of exposed clay subsoil, perhaps 80 yards east of the old elm tree, that had been the property corner marker since before anyone alive could remember. They would stand there, not grazing, not moving, just standing, sometimes with their noses down close to the dry gravel of the creek bed, sometimes just standing in a loose cluster, facing that bank as if waiting for something. The other 50-some animals would be spread out across the pasture doing ordinary cattle things. But those 7 to 12 would be at the bend, standing every afternoon, with a consistency that Clara began to note by number and by which animals were included. She cross-referenced it against her daily temperature and weather observations. It was not a warmth-seeking behavior because the bank faced north and was in shadow by mid-afternoon. It was not a shelter behavior because the overhang was not large enough to shelter more than 2 or 3 animals, and they were not huddled under it but standing in front of it. She wrote in her notebook, in the entry for the 14th of November, a line that read, "They are not going there for what I can see. They are going there for what I cannot." And then below that she wrote, in smaller letters, the 4 words her grandfather had written a decade and a half before her. "Water below here still." She had not planned to write it. She told me later it just came out of the pencil as if it had been waiting. She drove into town on the 17th of November, and she went to the extension office, and she spoke with the man there, who was a conscientious fellow with a clipboard and a clean Carhartt jacket, who had been serving that county for going on 9 years, and who knew his business reasonably well. She described the creek, the behavior of the cattle, the bend, the clay bank, the observations she had made over 3 weeks. He listened carefully, and he told her, without any unkindness, that a dry creek in a drought year was a dry creek, and that cattle will congregate along creek beds in dry conditions for a variety of reasons, including residual mineral deposits in the soil, old organic matter in the creek gravel, and simple habit from when water was present. He said that the water table in that drainage had been measured by the County Soil and Water Office at approximately 32 feet depth along the lower portions of the creek corridor, and that surface accessible water at that location was, in his assessment, not what the cattle were responding to. He had a number, 32 feet, and he said it in the way that men say a number when they mean for the number to close the conversation. Clara wrote it in her notebook. She thanked him. She drove home. She did not tell me about the conversation for another week, and when she told me, she said it in the same tone she would use to report the weather. She was not discouraged. I found that remarkable, and I told her so. She said that the man was probably right about 32 feet, but that the number was for the lower portion of the corridor, and she wanted to know what it was at the bend. She said her grandfather had drawn a line under his question and not answered it, and that a man that careful did not draw lines under questions he was not serious about. I did not have anything to say to that, so I went and checked on the hay bales again. She borrowed a hand probe and a soil auger from the Conservation District office on the 21st of November, a Friday, cold and clear, the first hard frost having come the week before, and the ground just tight enough at the surface to make the borrowing feel urgent. She went to the bend in the creek alone in the early morning, before the cattle had come down for the day. She set a grid. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. She did not just stick the probe in the ground at one spot and call it done. She laid out a grid along the creek bed at that bend, stakes and string, a pattern of test points spaced at 6-foot intervals, 17 points in total, which covered an area of roughly 30 by 40 feet. Centered on the spot where the cattle consistently stood, she probed each point in sequence, and she recorded the soil composition at each depth in her notebook, layer by layer, the surface sand and creek gravel, then the clay transition, then what was below the clay. At 4 of the 17 points, clustered in a rough oval on the upstream side of the bend, the auger hit something at between 14 and 17 feet that was not clay and was not gravel. It was wet, not damp, wet. She pulled the auger up at one of those 4 points, and the lower section was carrying visible moisture and a dark smear on the flighting that she recognized from her grandfather's notebook as the color he had described when he wrote about the soil change at the bend. She packed her tools. She drove to town, and she called a man named Gus Alderman, who had spent 31 years doing water well drilling and subsurface assessment in 3 counties, and who had a reputation, among the people who knew him, for being honest about what he found, even when honesty cost him a job. She asked him if he could come and look at something. He said he could come Thursday. Gus Alderman came on a Thursday in the first week of December. He wore a canvas vest, and he carried no clipboard. He drove a truck that had not been cleaned since approximately 1987, and I say that with respect, because a working truck carries its history, and there is nothing wrong with that. He walked the creek bed with Clara for about 40 minutes while I stood at the fence and watched. He did not say much while they walked. He crouched at the bend, and he put his hand into the creek gravel at one of the points where Clara had probed, and he held it there for a moment, and then he stood up and walked back toward the upstream section and crouched again. Clara showed him her notebook grid and her recorded depth readings, and he went through them page by page, slowly, without speaking. When he finished, he handed the notebook back to her, and he looked at the clay bank and then at the creek bed and then at the surrounding drainage pattern for a long moment. Then he said one word. He said, "substantial." He said it the way a man says a word when the word is carrying more weight than its two syllables would suggest. He did not elaborate immediately. Clara waited. I waited at the fence. After about 30 seconds of silence, he said that what she was describing and what the probe readings showed and what the drainage topography suggested was a confined lens of water bearing material sitting at between 14 and 19 feet below the creek bed surface at the bend, protected above by a continuous clay cap that the creek had undercut on the outside of the curve, which was why the surface showed dry while the subsurface held. He said the cattle were likely picking up the moisture gradient through the ground surface, particularly in the cold and still air of late afternoon when temperature differential between the wet subsurface and the dry surface would be at its greatest. He said he had seen this configuration twice before in his career, both times on outside bends of old creek systems, and both times a shallow well at the location had produced between 4 and 11 gallons per minute on a reliable year-round basis. He said the extension office number of 32 feet was probably accurate for the lower corridor, but that this bend was a structural anomaly in the drainage, and the depths here were entirely different. He said he could have a more definitive assessment within a week if she wanted to proceed. Clara asked him what he thought the probability was. He looked at the bend again, and then at her notebook, and then back at the bend. He said probably. He said it like a man who has drilled enough dry holes to know better than to say certainly, but who is shading toward yes, with everything in his face and his posture, and his one word. She told him to proceed. He drove away. I walked down from the fence line to where Clara was standing at the bend, and I looked at the clay bank and the creek gravel, and I thought about my father writing those 4 words in 1988 or 1989, and then putting the notebook in the chest. I thought about the fact that this ground had been in our family for 44 years at that point, and nobody had drilled. I thought about that for a while, standing there in the cold with the creek bed dry and gray around us and the cattle beginning to come down the slope in the late afternoon light, the familiar 7 or 8 of them drifting toward the bend without any apparent urgency, as if they were going to a place they had always known was there, which, it turned out, they were. Gus Alderman drilled on the 9th of December, a Tuesday, which I note because Tuesdays have a habit of being the day that things that have been waiting get answered. He hit water at 16 feet and 2 inches. He cased it to the surface, ran a pump test over 4 hours, and documented a sustained yield of 7.5 gallons per minute with no measurable drawdown after the 4 hours. He handed Clara the written test results in a manila folder and said that in his 31 years of drilling in this county, he had not encountered a confined shallow lens at this depth with this yield anywhere in this drainage, and that whoever had picked this location had picked it correctly. Clara said that her grandfather had picked it after a fashion. Gus Alderman nodded at that in the way an older man nods when something confirms what he already believed about the relationship between patience and ground, and then he got in his truck and drove to his next job. Clara had water, reliable, year-round, 16 feet deep, 7.5 gallon per minute water, sitting in the bend of a creek that had looked dry and useless and played out every summer since anyone in the county had been paying attention. The well itself cost her $840 to drill and case, not counting the pump and the line to the tank, which she ran the following spring, bringing the total infrastructure cost to just under $2,000, which, added to the $1,300 she had paid for the Heifers, meant she had invested slightly more than $3,000 total in a project that, by the following October, would show her the first clear return on a piece of ground that the county and her neighbor Harlan and the Extension Office, and frankly myself, had been willing to write off as marginal at best. The Heifers, for their part, had done what good cattle do when you give them time and feed, and a reason to come back to themselves. By March, they were carrying the look of animals that have decided to recover. By May, they were carrying calves, the ones that had been confirmed by the veterinarian to be bred before the estate sale, which was a number Clara had known about and the rest of us had not, which added another dimension to the $20 purchase that I had not fully appreciated at the time she made it. 41 of the 65 were confirmed bred, 41 calves. She had known that before she signed the bill of sale. She had asked the right question before she got to the pen, and she had gotten the answer, and she had done the arithmetic on the drive home. Harlan pulled up to the south fence on a morning in late September of 2004, almost exactly 11 months after he had asked what that girl was doing with 65 starving heifers in October. He left the truck running again, which I had come to understand was just his way, and did not indicate anything in particular about his intentions. He looked at the cattle, which were now considerably different animals than they had been, and he looked at the tank that was running on the new well line, and then he looked at me. He said it looks like the water situation sorted itself out. I told him it had always been sorted, we just had not known it yet. He looked at the cattle a while longer, and then looked at the tank again. He said that was not as dry a creek as it had always looked. I said, no, it was not. He nodded. He said he supposed Clara knew her business. Then he put his truck in gear and drove back up the fence line. That was all. No ceremony, no extended conversation, no acknowledgement of what he had said on the October morning of the year before. Just the one quiet sentence, and then the truck moving away through the Osage orange, and that was enough. That has always been enough. The land does not require a ceremony. The quiet concession from a certain man is its own kind of validation, and I have learned to accept it in the spirit in which it is offered, which is the spirit of a man who is more comfortable with being wrong than he will ever be comfortable with saying so directly. I respect that, actually. It takes a particular kind of integrity to drive back to the fence when the evidence has changed and offer even the small acknowledgement. Most people do not. What I think about when I think about that year is not the well or the water yield or the economics of 41 calves from a $1,300 purchase, though the economics are worth thinking about. What I think about is my father writing those 4 words in the back of his last notebook and then, for whatever reason, not pursuing them. I have tried to reconstruct what would have stopped him. He was not a timid man. He was not a man who abandoned questions. I think the most likely answer is the simplest one, which is that the seasons kept moving and the question got filed as the next thing to do, and then the next thing to do became the season after that, and then it was 1989, and then it was further on, and the question sat in the notebook, and the notebook went in the chest. This is a thing that happens. It happens to all of us. We are standing at the edge of something that matters, and we write it down as a reminder, and then we go check on the hay bales. And the hay bales are a real thing that require real attention, and by the time we look up, the season has moved. My father is gone 11 years as of the autumn of that story. He did not know he was leaving a gift in that chest. He was just keeping his records the way he always had, the way a faithful man keeps records, not knowing who will read them or when, but trusting that the writing down is its own form of care for whoever comes after. I think about that when I keep my own records now, which I do in the same kind of marbled composition book, though the ones I buy run a little more than they used to. I try to write clearly. I try to write the things I notice, and the questions I have not yet answered, and I try not to let the unanswered questions go too long without being followed up, because I know now what a question underlined and left alone can cost you in years, and I know what it can mean to the right person who finds it when they are ready to follow it forward. That is not a small thing. The difference between a question abandoned and a question deferred is sometimes the whole story, and the whole story, in this case, was about 7.5 gallons per minute and 65 heifers that knew where the water was before we did. They paid attention. They always pay attention. The animals always know. The ground always knows. The question is just whether we are willing to be still long enough and humble enough and patient enough to be told what it is that they know. That has been the lesson of my farming life more times than I can count, and I do not expect it to stop being the lesson in whatever farming years I have remaining. You cannot farm what you've already decided isn't worth the knowing. That is something my father said, not in any notebook, just at a fence line one morning when I was young enough to hear it and old enough to write it down in the part of myself where things get stored for later. Clara heard it too, not from him. She was too young. But she arrived at the same place by her own road, the way the stubborn and the attentive always do, which is by watching the cattle walk to the bend every afternoon and asking not what they are doing, but what they are trying to tell her. I am proud of her for that. I am proud of her for reading the notebook and not putting it back in the chest. I am proud of her for the 17-point grid and the spiral notebook in the coat pocket, and the 45 minutes she spent in that sail pen before she signed her name. And I am grateful, in the way you are grateful for things you did not earn and cannot repay, that my father wrote down his questions, even the ones he ran out of season to answer, because the questions were the inheritance, and she was exactly the kind of person to receive them. If you have got a piece of ground that everybody around you has decided is settled and known and played out, or a dry creek nobody looks at anymore, or an old notebook with a question in it that somebody underlined and never answered, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, if it felt like something you have lived or something you needed to hear, subscribe to this channel and stay with us, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there, and there is always another piece of ground worth looking at carefully if you are willing to take the time.